All right, so let me have your attention. I was trying to get this set up to record because Logan's not here. Hi, Logan. So I'm recording it for her. The first thing we're going to do today, so we're going to talk about the Great Depression, but before we do that, so we're going to kind of, first off, I shared with you something about I'm taking a survey on the portfolio, just because I was at that conference this weekend, and anyway, so I just want to kind of check and make sure it's anonymous. I won't know who says what. Just let me know your feedback. Right now, it's kind of split evenly. I'm kind of verbally getting a little feedback to see what people like. Seventh period was like. There were a few that were like, but then there were a few that were like, no, we like doing it. So I don't know. So just kind of be sure you do that. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to work in kind of a Great Depression context, if you will, and we're going to do that as kind of a class activity. So I'm going to kind of assign this to you now, and then if you'll have that for the next class. The instructions are on this slide. This is shared with you guys, so everybody can edit it, right? So we're going to make this kind of one big collaborative kind of thing. And what you're going to do is we're going to divide you up into pairs, and you're going to get a particular year. And you are going to essentially, with the year that you are assigned, you and your partner are going to identify 3 headlines from your year. Try to do this across a couple of different sizes of towns. So maybe a big town, maybe a medium-sized town, maybe a small town. And I'm not going to get too nitpicky about that. Use your best judgment. I mean, obviously we know a big town would be New York, Chicago, something like that. When you get to medium and small size, it gets a little trickier. But as long as it's good faith effort, what I wanted to see is a range. Not just the Northeast coast or something like that. I'm trying to get a sense for what the headlines look like across the country. Then 3 to 5 economic statistics for the year that you have, and I listed out a few types of economic statistics, things like employment, wages, housing costs, gross domestic product, savings, bank closures, just kind of whatever comes to mind as far as an economic statistic. Identify 3 to 5 pieces of media from your year. These can be advertisements. These can be photos, radio clips, movie clips, novel excerpts. Anything that kind of gives us a snapshot about what ordinary people are dealing with. Okay? So I want us to kind of work together to kind of get a sense for what the context is. What do real people deal with? Because I'm going to be kind of giving you in direct teaching kind of the nuts and bolts of the politics and kind of the big picture economically. But you need to understand that there's people behind these statistics. And so that's what I'm hoping that you'll see by doing this. So we'll kind of create this together. If you'll have it done by the time you come back on Thursday, and then that way at the start of class Thursday we can kind of go through this and look at the statistics and see what we were doing. One of the big things that I want you to do, though, is to make a claim about your year. After you look at these different things, make a statement. Make a profound statement about your year and what it tells us. For example, as I'm teaching the Great Depression, I want you to think and keep in mind this particular claim that I'm going to start out with making. And then when we get to the end of the lecture part, we're going to discuss and kind of maybe debate whatever, whether or not you think I proved my claim. Okay? And the claim I'm saying is that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. So I'm starting that off as the claim that I'm going to say. The New Deal ended the Great Depression. I want you guys to evaluate. By the time I get done with the lecture, by the time you get done with your own context for the year that you're assigned, do you think that is true? And then we'll kind of bandy that around, okay, and see what you think. That's kind of the intent there. So just like I'm making a claim, I'm staking a claim about the Great Depression and the New Deal in general. I want you to come up with a claim about your particular year. all right? And that can kind of be what you and your partner decide. Does that make sense? So it's not particularly hard, 1 or 2 slides. Just put the stuff on there. Should be super easy, won't take you very long. The big thing is that I want you to do this in pairs. There's 22 of us in here. There's 11 years. And then we need to kind of count off the years. So let's see. Do we want to kind of divide by table or just kind of let y'all sort it out? Divide by table would be easy. All right, so why don't we do 29 and 31 over here. So Reagan and I guess Logan, or Logan and one of y'all. Logan, you'll be with your table, so find somebody. So 29 and 31. We'll have 33 and 35. We'll have 37 and 39. We'll have, oh, wait a minute. I've got, okay. 41 and 32, right? 34 and 36. And somebody needs to do 38. Okay? So make sure that kind of gives you a sense. I'll let this kind of cluster figure out what year y'all are doing. Okay? If somebody needs me to intervene more directly and say this is specifically the year you're doing, then let me know. Otherwise, I'll let you guys sort it out. Okay? Sure. That's fine.
It's kind of like off-topic question. But
yes.
Do we have to pertain to your theme, white and black, or can we like personalize it?
Oh, you can personalize it. I don't care. I have absolutely no preference. No, I was just throwing it together, right? Because what I want us to do is to come back on Thursday, and this will kind of give us a really good idea. Like I said, of kind of what the arc of the Great Depression is. You'll get a sense for where it started, where it ended. You'll get a sense for what it was like for people. I think it'll be kind of instructional to help you really kind of dig into some of the aspects of the Great Depression without having to do a ton of research, right? And there's all kinds of resources out there. There's archives. There's newspapers. Think of some towns and do a search for newspaper archives. There's lots of different ways you can find that out. Look up statistics for a particular year. So it shouldn't be too onerous to have to go kind of dig around for some of this. And like I said, you've got a couple days to do it. So any questions on kind of what this context activity is all about? It's pretty straightforward. So anyway, so you got that. All right. So like I said, I'm starting off with a claim about the Great Depression. Now remember, we talked about the 1920s, or you read mostly about the 1920s. Remember that the 1920s is what we call a bull period. Like stocks are growing and expanding, and we've got this kind of perception of prosperity. But by the time you get to the late 1920s, this prosperity is pretty much kind of fake, right? It's not an authentic prosperity because it's built on credit, right? People are borrowing money to buy things. Wages aren't keeping up with what people are having to spend. Excuse me, I had pizza for lunch. If wages aren't keeping up, you've got kind of a misdistribution of wealth where a small group of people own most of the wealth for the country and not very many people have a lot of wealth. So you've got lots of problems that kind of carry, the whole, the 1920s, especially the last couple of years. You have an increasing farm crisis that's happening. And still you go into 1929 with kind of this sense of enthusiasm that the election of Hoover is going to bring 4 more years of prosperity. But we find out by October of 1929 that's not going to be the case. And while as we start to figure out that the prosperity is not going to stay around, we realize that this is, that it's not going to be easy. Okay, so let's talk about kind of some of these pictures and see what we see in these photos. Okay, one benefit to studying the Great Depression is there was a lot of documentation. The documentation comes in part because of technology, because of cameras, because of radio, because of film, but it also comes about because you have, by the time you get to 34 and 35, you have the government creating programs that are trying to create jobs for artists, photographers, historians, right? Journalists, people that aren't good at construction work, for instance. We have lots of jobs programs out there, but you're not going to take somebody like me, who's a historian who knows how to write, and say, here, go pave a road, right? That would not be very helpful. So one of the things that they do is they find ways to create jobs for people that don't do that kind of stuff. And so one of them is by documenting the stories, collecting oral histories, and doing that sort of thing. And so we have a lot of records about the Great Depression and about the New Deal programs and all these conditions that go on. So that's one of the benefits that we have. So what do you see in this first picture right here? What jumps to mind? What's it showing us?
Probably moving.
Moving, migration. Internal migration is a big, big issue during the Great Depression. People are losing their homes. They're having to sell everything they own. They're having to hit the road and go find work. This is true for people that live in the Great Plains that are affected by the Dust Bowl. This is true by people who live in cities. Everyone's packing up. So lots of internal migration of people. We saw that in the 19-teens going into World War I, where you had that great migration of people coming up, African Americans coming from the South into the North, taking those factory jobs. And you had Mexican immigrants coming up, escaping the Mexican Civil War, taking some of the agricultural jobs. Well, now, with the loss of employment and with farms going under, you have people losing their homes, and they're starting to try to find work. And so as they're trying to find work, you're going to have a displacement of immigrants. So the recent Mexican immigrants that have come in taking the jobs, they're going to be repatriated, deported. They're just going to move back because people are having a preference for hiring native-born white Americans because there's lots of those without jobs. And so you have kind of a shift as far as immigration, but you also have another profound shift with internal migration. And so it's important to kind of recognize that that's a characteristic of the Great Depression. Oops, come back. What do those pictures show you? Okay, yes. I cannot overstate the extent to which people thought it was the end of the world on the Great Plains. That includes Texas, that includes Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, up into the Dakotas. There were some of these dust storms that were so bad that the dust would eventually make its way to the East Coast. There were a couple of times the dust would affect conditions in New York City. You're talking about major, major problems. And this is largely man-made. Because remember, we'd encouraged farmers to grow and to grow and to grow, and they had. And they had not used sound farming practices. This was exacerbated by raising the tariffs in the 1920s that made it harder for farmers to sell their product. And so they had to grow more so that they could continue to make money and make their loan payments. And so they did not use good farming techniques. And so they depleted the topsoil in the Great Plains. And then you have a drought. And with that drought and the depleted topsoil and the winds, and there you go. Okay? And it, huge health hazard for people, as you can well imagine. Breathing in the dust, people got dust pneumonia, created all kinds of breathing problems, made people sick. You had animals that would die because they ingested so much dirt. So pretty dramatic conditions with the Dust Bowl. That shows you could not keep it out of the house. There were all kinds of tricks, putting wet cloths in the window, and the dust would just come in. What about this one? What do these pictures tell you? Their signs say, wanted a decent job. The one says family man. This one says, buy a decent man, age 37, family, war veteran, paying on home, college trained, native Chicagoan. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like at this point, your average Americans are starting to lose their job and are desperate to
Yes. The average, the people that you would not have thought would lose their job. So we're accustomed, maybe that's the wrong word, but you know, the Gilded Age had seen kind of the impact of people struggling to keep their jobs as far as the factory system, right? Factory workers. But this is going to affect your middle class people, right? Your supervisors, your managers, your stockbrokers, your people that you would not normally have thought of, especially in the Gilded Age, certainly in the 1920s, as being susceptible to unemployment. These are not people that have drinking problems. These are not people that are lazy. These are people for whom conditions have gotten out of hand. Okay, and you definitely see that ordinary people are being profoundly affected. Why do you think I juxtapose that with this billboard? Mm-hmm.
It's ironic because the American
It is ironic. Remember, you've got lots of effort to say, hey, you know, we're America. And yet you have in 32 and 33 and 34 contrasts with how people are living in the real world. Another ironic. One of the impacts is not only internal migration of families, but also men going out on their own trying to find work, especially young men. Some men would leave their families because the perception was it was more acceptable for a woman and children to go get assistance than it was for a family to go get assistance, so men would leave their families. Men sometimes left their families to go find work. Young men would leave their families to go try to get a job so they could send money back home. This leads to kind of sociologically what we would call kind of the first subculture, right, which is going to be the hobos. And the way that the hobos, kind of that's why I was playing Roger Miller's King of the Road when y'all walked in, because that's a song about a hobo, right? So definitely kind of creates a unique subculture, creates profound disruptions for family units, either because as a family they have to pack up and move, or as a family they're doing without, or because in cases of men leaving their families, or families being split up. So it's highly disruptive, and I think it's important to recognize that it has these implications as far as, you know, breaking apart the family unit and making it harder for people to be okay. There you go, more pictures of migrants. What do you think the impact to children was? Yes, right. That if your family's packed up and moving, or if you're, you know, trying to find something to make a little money, you're not going to school. So lost educational opportunities. What else? Mm-hmm.
Maybe like malnourishment.
Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, one of the implications when we get to like 1940 and we reinstitute the draft after the fall of France, and they're starting to bring soldiers in, they realize, number one, that you've got soldiers that are malnourished, right? And we need to get these guys healthy again. We also have soldiers that have lost education, that we've got to train them and test them and do all this kind of stuff, because we've had a population that for 10 years has had to learn to do without. And so malnourishment is a big part of that. You know, so you see lots of kind of implications for kids. It even shapes kids that are too young to truly be malnourished. I was telling seventh period. So my mom and dad, my dad was born in 36, my mom was born in 38. So neither one of them are really old enough. My dad a little more so than my mom. Remember bits and pieces, right? But there's a couple little stories, little anecdotes. The first one is that my mom, born in 38, to a farming family in Ohio, family of 5 kids, but it was that my grandfather had been pretty careful with money. They had to tighten their belt, but they didn't do that. They lived on a farm. They had their own chickens. They had, their own vegetables. They, all this kind of stuff. So they made a lot of their own stuff, and so they never really went without food. And my mom doesn't remember how hard they had it financially, but implications are that they managed, right? That it wasn't easy, but it wasn't as hard as it could have been. But my mom remembers being told to always clean her plate. Always, always, always. And would be scolded. There are people that go without food. And you have the benefit of having food to eat. So you better eat every bit of it. And to this day, she still, hates to leave food. And, it feels like it's a moral thing for her. That it's so wasteful. And that comes from her parents being very aware of how fortunate they were to have access to their own food. They didn't have to worry about their kids going hungry. Had a huge impact on her. Now, my dad, who was born in 1936, it had a little more of an impact on him. His family was not as well off as my mom's to begin with. So there was a lot more job hopping, a lot more moving around. My dad changed schools almost every year. So it wasn't that he wasn't able to go to school, but frequent disruptions, right? He remembers being little bitty, like before World War II, and having to put cardboard in his shoes because there were holes in the bottom of it, and there wasn't money to go buy new shoes. He remembers living in some pretty bad houses, and that kind of thing, and neighborhoods that were scary, and the family being anxious about what environment they were in. And to this day, my dad saves spare change. So much so that he'll have at any given time $500 or $600 in spare change in jars and cans in his closet. Because and one year, this was like a decade ago, the kids were counting up his change, seeing how much change he had in there. He had like almost $600, and we were like, wow, that's a lot of money. And he said, if something happened and all the banks shut down, he said, I would have this money, to him, this is a habit that he watched his parents do, that kind of money anxiety that he's held on to, that he continues to do these things, even though that really wasn't, by the time, he was a teenager, that wasn't his experience, and certainly what hasn't been his experience as an adult, but it still shapes him today. So the Great Depression has this profound impact even from the youngest generation, even from those that were born in 35 and 36 and 37. Those kids were shaped by what their parents were going through. My husband's grandparents used to stockpile canned vegetables. They would, like, when they both passed away, they found canned vegetables stored all over the house. Like, these are the kind of things that, we don't think about. We look at these pictures and we think, oh, wow, that was terrible. But it had implications for a while. Very disruptive for everyone, and shapes behaviors in all kinds of different ways. What does this one tell you? Lots of unemployed Americans. Yep. How does this, we're coming off of a period, going from the 1920s, where everything was prosperous, and it seemed like the message of individualism and capitalism and free enterprise was the way to go. How does this square with individualism? Do you think all these men were just lazy and didn't deserve to have a job anyways? And think about what they're having to do to stand in line to get coffee and donuts. Okay? So, yeah. Shows you some of the housing that they would have lived in. So, yeah. Profound disruptions. Even when families stay together, it's disruptive. Let alone if the families don't stay together. These kind of show you, so when people lose their homes, they have to go find some place to live. They go live in a tent, they live in their car, sometimes they put together a shack, they go find a vacant lot or an abandoned building or something, a roadside, and they start throwing these things up. And they start calling these things Hoovervilles in honor of President Hoover, right? Because they're blaming Hoover for the Great Depression. Now, we, as kind of historians, can look backwards and say, well, it couldn't have been all Hoover's fault, right? I mean, the signs were there before the election. But that's not how this stuff works. It doesn't matter that we can logically say, well, the conditions were before that, right? It was the actions of this person before. When an economic crisis or an economic boom happens, people tend to attribute it to the president in charge. And that happens over and over and over again. One of your classic examples is Bush 41 in the early 90s. Raised taxes, the economy boomed, Clinton got all the credit for it. Even though what Clinton does is set us up for the economic disaster that will happen in the 2000s. Again, consider this question of individualism. Who's really to blame for this? And what is our obligation? What is our obligation to these men? What is our obligation to their families? What is our obligation to children? And as this economic circumstance gets worse and worse and worse, as people lose their homes and businesses shut down, you have cities and states losing their tax base. So there's not money for public schools. There's not money to fix roads. There's not money for government offices and government programs. So it has these long-range implications. It's not just the immediate impact that you see with people losing jobs. It's also how that snowballs into other factors that begins to affect all facets of American life. Again, look at that line of people. People would wait in line for bread. They'd wait in line for food. They'd wait in line for jobs. Notice most of these are men. The perception was that women should not be out competing for jobs. You still have very much this kind of gender system where men are supposed to be the primary wage earners. Women are not. So for women, it was particularly dangerous, right? Because if your husband couldn't find work, you weren't supposed to go find work, even if you could find something. Now, that doesn't mean women didn't, because they do. But it's an interesting dilemma, because the perception was that men should be the ones out earning the wages. This picture right here is a famous picture taken by Dorothea Lange. The title of it is called The Migrant Mother. So she is a farm migrant escaping the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains, going to California. And I'm trying to remember, and don't quote me on this, but if I remember the story correctly, they are migrating to California. They've broken down in like Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, somewhere between like Oklahoma and California. And their car's broken down, and they're out of money, and she sells the tires on the car to buy food for the kids. And so now she's going to be stranded. So this is the kind of despair. And again, think in terms of the malnutrition, all these kind of health ramifications, sanitation ramifications, lots of issues. That's a classic Hooverville for you. Again, very difficult conditions, people having to sell off everything. This right here, jobless men keep going, we can't take care of our own. One of the things that we'll see is that, especially during Hoover's administration, there was lots of emphasis on local communities taking care of their own. Cities and states taking care of their own people. And there's a reason for this. There's a logic for it. Okay? Now, we talked about supply-side economics when we talked about the 1920s. We cut taxes, people have more money to spend, we reduce the size of government. This stimulates economic growth, right? And it worked great in the 1920s. And it clearly has a role to play, especially in conditions like 1921, where the big problem is there's just not enough money going in the economy. If you give people a little more cash, things are going to get better. But the problem with that kind of very conservative economic outlook is that it also says, if we're not, first off, if we don't have big government, we don't have a government to intervene. Remember, like, this is what made the 1920s different from, say, the Progressive era. The Progressive era saw that you had government seeing itself as having a role to play. Government was supposed to regulate and influence and do all that kind of stuff, right? Well, the 1920s says, no, we don't want any government being involved. Well, so if you're coming at it from that perspective, and you don't see government as having a role to play, what you're going to say is, it is not right for the federal government to collect taxes to distribute to people in need. That is up to states and localities. States and local entities can collect taxes or whatever they want to do for their group of people, and that way those people know that they best know how to distribute relief money and aid money. Because that community is going to know who are the people to trust, who are the people not to trust, who are the, all that kind of stuff. And that the federal government should not be involved in that. That is the argument, okay? Now, is that a good argument? That's for each person to decide. It is still a valid argument today. When the president proposes a budget that cuts social safety net, cuts Medicare, cuts Medicaid, what he's saying is it's not up to the federal government to do this. It's up to states and local governments to do this. And if states and local governments want to collect their own taxes or whatever and distribute money to people in need, that's up to them. Okay? So it is a legitimate theory and idea. Now, you might not agree with it, right? And there's policy implications and all this kind of stuff, right? But fundamentally, at its very heart, it is a reasonable policy stance. Now, it wouldn't be my policy stance, but it is a reasonable one. And so when you hear people and politicians and pundits and, even friends who think differently, when they discuss these ideas about how do we give assistance to people, do we let the federal government do it, or do we let local entities, charities, state agencies, city agencies, do we let them do it, right? Those are valid concerns. So what's happening, particularly under Hoover, he's a product of this 1920s. Remember, he goes back to kind of as Secretary of Commerce and all that kind of stuff. And so his attitude is local entities should be the ones to take care of the needs. That it's not right for the federal government to collect taxes from all 50 states to distribute money to a small group of people, or to people in one area or a different area. We saw that same line of reasoning a few weeks ago when we looked at, was it Chester Arthur or Grover Cleveland that vetoed the Seed Bill for Texas? He does that because he says it's not constitutional. This is not the role of the federal government. Well, Hoover's taking the same kind of tactic, right? This is not what the government's supposed to be doing. Well, the issue here is by 1932-33, local entities can't take care of their own people. They're out of money too. So it doesn't matter how big or how small your town is, they're struggling as well. Now, one of the things we'll see is that Franklin Roosevelt, who wins in 1932, one of the reasons why people vote for him is because he had been governor of New York, and he was very well known for, simply, using the state budget to kind of provide relief payments. Now, New York was a big state, had a lot of money and all that kind of stuff, so it's one of the reasons it can do that. So it's a very different proposition if you're talking about, Nevada, for instance, prior to Las Vegas. So lots of kind of interesting nuances that you kind of see there. And again, what is our obligation? Is this individualism? Where does this fall in the American dream? What can we say to this? And this moment in time, this Great Depression, so profoundly impacts people that we'll see all throughout the 1930s. They keep asking, how did this happen? How did we get here? And understand that behind every statistic every political story that I tell you, you've got people that lost everything, watched their families break up, watched people get sick and die, didn't have enough food to eat. I mean, there's people behind this event in history. And, you know, because we have such good documentation, it allows us to be able to really kind of identify with what they're dealing with. Okay? So just, I wanted to kind of show you those pictures and kind of give you those mental images. There's some pictures in the PowerPoint, but not quite as many. All right, so let's talk about Hoover. Okay? So I'll try not to be repetitive. So we come in from 1929. Hoover wins. The stock market crash happens. Okay? And Hoover's trying to calm everybody down. We saw this a couple weeks ago when the stock market was going crazy. How many of you saw stories a few days later that were, the stock market's not the economy? Right? Everybody just calm down. Just because the stock market went a little crazy, it's all going to be fine. Right? Well, and it might. Right? Like I said before, stock market's more like taking your temperature. Right? You have to look at other factors to really know what it means. But that being said, there was a lot of stories that popped up in the week after that that basically said, you know, it'll all be okay. So Hoover comes in, and in fall of 29, early 1930, he's trying to calm everybody down. It's going to be okay. We're going to take care of it, right? And this cartoon kind of shows you, here's poor Herbert Hoover trying to get everybody, the drought damage, the business depression, the tariff issue. Because remember, in the 1920s, we jacked tariffs up to protect manufacturing. We had immigration restrictions. So the idea was that we were protecting manufacturing, and that's part of what leads to the problems with farmers. Well, that doesn't change with Herbert Hoover. You still have Republicans in charge of Congress, and those Republicans want to keep the tariffs high. So here's Hoover trying to deal with the farming situation, a drought, the business depression, and here's the Democrats making all this noise, pointing out to everybody, not letting things calm down, stirring up trouble, making everybody scared. That's what this cartoon means. So you thought partisanship was just for 2018. No. So you have Republicans saying that if the Democrats would just stop telling people that we had to be concerned, then everybody would relax and calm down and the economy might get better. This is one of Herbert Hoover's big tactics. Let's just get everyone to calm down. Okay? Let's all just cooperate. Now, remember, this is where his preference lies anyways. Going back to his role in charge of the Food Administration during World War I, where he would argue that people should voluntarily grow their own vegetables, people should voluntarily do without meat or do without wheat or whatever. Big fan of volunteerism. And he, you know, when he becomes Secretary of Commerce, his attitude towards trusts and monopolies and business regulation was that the government should not regulate with a hammer. In other words, the government shouldn't threaten businesses. Instead, they should encourage them to cooperate. Gee, don't act that way. That stifles competition, and that's not good for anybody. So everybody play nice together. Well, in the 1920s, there was plenty of money to be had. Nobody was super worried about that. Okay, so just understand this is where he comes from. This is kind of his associational kind of mindset. So when the Depression happens, this is what he's trying to do, right? The worst effects will have passed during the next 60 days. That's in May of 1960. You know, he's trying to get businesses to promise to keep paying wages. Don't lay people off. Just keep paying wages. The economy's going to turn around. The problem with that, though, is that remember that we've got this economic downward spiral where businesses are shutting their doors, banks are closing, there's not any money for businesses to kind of, you know, tie over and pay wages even when they're not making a lot of money. There's a surplus of product, people don't have money to spend, they're maxed out on credit, or they're losing their jobs, and we don't have foreign markets because tariffs are high. And now on top of this, you've got a farming depression going on, so farmers are not able to buy things, and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. Well, eventually, and by eventually I mean pretty quickly, by 3031, businesses can no longer afford to just keep their doors open just because Herbert Hoover says, let's all cooperate. Remember, businesses exist to make a profit. That is what makes them a business. Now, governments do not exist to make a profit. Governments exist to govern. Governments have the ability to spend money they don't have, to operate in the red. A business cannot operate in the red indefinitely. Eventually, somebody's going to say, you need to pay up. For governments, it's a little different, and that's an important distinction, okay? So businesses are starting to struggle, and in fact, by the time you get to 1931, they're laying off more and more people, right? So this positive, calm reasoning is not going to hold through because businesses will not be able to keep their doors open. They're not going to be able to function that way. And banks can't keep loaning money. Yes. And so Hoover's going to finally, by 1931, begin to embrace a couple of small ideas. Well, let me rephrase it. They're big ideas, but he'll embrace them very, very carefully. The first one is going to be public works. Public works is the idea that the government, because remember, the government can spend money it doesn't have, right? It can operate in the red and do so for quite a long period of time, right? Now, we could get into an argument about deficit spending, which is something we are going to talk about, because the question about deficit spending is relevant to the conversation about the Great Depression. And this conversation about deficit spending and supply side and taxes and do we help people, do we not help people, this debate is still with us. We still have it, okay? So you might as well get kind of used to hearing people talk in these terms, okay? So a public works project says it's basically infrastructure. Let's build a road, let's build a bridge, let's build a water system, a sewer system, a hydroelectric dam, a hospital, you name it, right? That's public works. And that's the government spending money to build something to benefit everybody. And because it's the government, right, they can basically start the project even if, they're having to use tax dollars from other places and all that kind of stuff. So they have a little more funding flexibility. And they will create these projects that then create jobs. So, for instance, it's under Hoover that we'll do the Hoover Dam. Throughout the Southwest, there have been rapid flooding. Los Angeles is growing by leaps and bounds. They're desperate for electricity. The idea is developed that, hey, if we create a hydroelectric dam along the Colorado River, then we'll be able to provide electricity to Southern California. And this happens about 1931. And Hoover's like, okay, well, this is a public works project, but we can do this. It's going to benefit a lot of people. It'll benefit the country. And so he signs off on it, right? And he's very cautious, but he does sign off on that. And it does create jobs. You have contractors that then hire people. But again, it's just one project. And you'll have a couple of smaller projects, but they're not enough to make a dent in the amount of unemployment that we see happening. And of course, the big problem, the reason why they don't make too many of these public works projects, is because Hoover has this big question about how good is it, how is it right to create a public works project that, say, benefits Southern California, but that the rest of the country pays for. Should we pay for farm relief for the Great Plains when it doesn't benefit people in the Northeast? So who pays for what? How much of the taxpayers' money can the government spend without kind of, messing up, right? What is the government's responsibility for fiscal responsibility, right? Which is a term you ought to be familiar with. So that's the big question. The next thing is Hoover tries to encourage the Federal Reserve to kind of lower interest rates, right? Remember, cash flow is like the grease in an engine. So if the economy is an engine, and during the Great Depression it's kind of like stuck, right? We need to get lots of grease going in that thing to try to loosen it up. So Hoover's like, come on, Federal Reserve, lower the interest rates. But remember, the Federal Reserve has had people put on it by these conservative Harding and Coolidge administrations. And so they're like, gee, I don't know about this, right? So they don't lower interest rates. So Hoover does something that's pretty unique, which is he creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The RFC is intended, it basically creates the government as a bank. We still have these in kind of forms today. If you think about Fannie Mae, which provides home loans, or VHA loans, student loans from the Department of Ed. Those are government loan programs where the government kind of acts like a bank. And so he comes up with this idea. And it's targeted towards railroads and banks and that kind of thing to try to get money moving in the economy again. But again, he puts in charge of it people who are kind of cautious and careful. And this is a new idea, and everybody's like, I'm not so sure about this, and so they're kind of hesitant. And so the RFC does exist, and it will play a bigger role as we get under FDR and we get to World War II. But here during Hoover's administration, it's pretty restrained. But it is a new idea, and it's an idea that we still have with us today. So Hoover, it's unfair to say that Hoover doesn't do anything, because he does. The question is, how much does he do, and is it enough, right? So Hoover's going to be one of his big hang-ups. So he admits to the Works project because he thinks that at least if you're creating a public works project, that people are having to work for their money. Yes, you've got this pesky question about taxpayer dollars, but people are working to get paid, and that preserves the American character. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation is the government trying to intervene very carefully in the economy to get money moving again, especially when the Federal Reserve doesn't want to. But he's a little more restrained when it comes to what we call direct relief. Direct relief is, here's money. You're unemployed, here's some money. It can also be, here's food stamps, here's housing assistance, right? That's direct relief. Now, sometimes direct relief comes in the form of, say, food stamps, or, here's a box of food. Sometimes relief comes in the form of cash. Here's cash to go pay your rent or whatever you need to do. And this question of relief payments, by the time you get to 31 and 32, you've got a fourth of the country unemployed. And when I say a fourth of the country unemployed, understand that the criteria by which they define unemployed in 1932 is different than the way we define it today. Today, if you're retired, you can't be unemployed. If you're 16, you can't be unemployed. If you've given up finding a job and you're not even trying, you can't be unemployed. If you're a stay-at-home mom, who maybe wants to get a job but you've decided not to, you don't count as unemployed, right? But in 1932, anybody that was working age, so you're talking like 16 to, however old, you could be counted as unemployed. So really, this 1/4 of the country is probably more like 1/3. So you're talking about a bigger portion of the country is struggling with unemployment. And we're also not talking necessarily about, dual income families. We're talking about a family for whom the husband is the only breadwinner. So they could have 3 or 4 kids, and the husband's the only one that can work. So it's not just one person that's being impacted. It's, 4, 5, 6. So when we talk about this question of relief payments, understand that the numbers of unemployed are pretty significant by 32. And Hoover's dealing with this question of, do we give people money? Do we just hand them cash and say, here you go? And he has a problem with that. He thinks it's going to hurt the American individual, right? It's going to hurt our work ethic. We'll lose what makes us American. This idea that we work hard and we try hard and all that kind of stuff, right? So he's very concerned about that. He's also concerned about this question of who pays, right? Is it right for the federal government to take federal dollars and distribute it to people in states? Aren't the state and local charities that are able to do that? Okay, that debate that we talked about earlier. So you have this whole issue going on. He's very resistant to emergency relief. By late 1932, Congress does pass the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, which is public works and direct relief money to be distributed to the states, for the states to administer. Hoover signs it, albeit reluctantly, but it's not enough. By the time they get that money distributed tainted, it's, the economic depression is too bad. And so this is going to be a significant problem. They're just being so cautious, right? Now, maybe if they had done this in 1930, maybe that would have made a difference. But by 1932, by the second half of 1932, it's too late. It's just too late for this. There's too many people unemployed. The economy is ground to a halt, and they can't get enough, pressure, enough leverage to get things going again. So, how does America respond to Hoover? Well, they blame him, right? The president who's in charge when it happens is the one who gets the credit. So Hoover gets blamed. He gets blamed in part because people have lost their homes. They start calling their shanty towns Hoovervilles in honor of President Hoover. You have people doing hunger marches, marching, to draw attention to the fact they're starving, they don't have jobs. You have the Communist Party becomes very active, as does the Fascist Party in the 1930s. Remember, it's by 32 that Hitler's starting to come to power, right? He's the chancellor by 32. By 32, the Nazis have the majority in the Reichstag, in the German parliament. So, extreme ideas abound in 32. And so you've got this kind of, lots of kind of agitation going on. You have farmers destroying their crops, desperate to raise prices, thinking scarcity might raise the prices. Of course, they're destroying crops and livestock and milk while people are starving. So here's the big question. Why not just buy up the extra food, the extra crops, the extra livestock, and distribute it to people in need? Well, that takes us back to the direct relief question. How much should the federal government be involved in that? These are some pesky questions, okay? And we don't quite have the full farm subsidy program that we see going on here. Ironically, part of the SNAP program, the food stamp program, kind of does this, buy surplus crops from farmers to transition to, that kind of thing. So you definitely see that creates an issue. You're going to see the bonus army. Well, one of the things that's going to make Hoover look particularly bad is that Hoover doesn't meet with World War I veterans. The World War I veterans in kind of the heyday of the 1920s and that we're never going to be in another world war and we love our veterans and all this kind of stuff, they passed this idea for a bonus to be paid in 1945. So they passed it in 24 or something like that. So 20 years later they'd pay this bonus. Well, you have this congressman, this representative from Texas that says, why don't we pay them their bonus early? Then that way that'll help the veterans and all that kind of stuff. And the veterans are like, yeah, sure. And it passes the House and goes to the Senate. But it's stalled out in the Senate, right? The Senate's much more conservative. They're not sure that they're okay with all this deficit spending. So they're kind of arguing about it. And the World War I veterans decide to march to Washington to express their support of this idea. We're going to march. We're going to let Congress know, let the president know that we need this. This is not a handout. This is money you promised us, 10 years ago or 8 years ago. It's only fair. We desperately need it now. Just give it to us a little bit early. And they go to Washington, D.C. They want to meet with the president, but the president won't meet with them. He won't intervene and put pressure on the Senate to try to pass this bill. So it fails in the Senate, and it goes back to the House. So what's going to happen is that the World War I veterans are going to decide to stay in Washington, D.C. to try to draw enough attention to the issue to get this thing moved to the House and the Senate again. Well, the problem is, so what's going to happen is that they're arguing that they're going to stay there. So they're occupying vacant land, they're occupying vacant buildings, they're doing all this kind of stuff, and they're living in Hoovervilles, right? Except this looks kind of bad. Remember, this is 32. This is an election year. It looks bad for Herbert Hoover to have World War I veterans staked out in a shanty town in Washington, D.C., within view of the Capitol building. It just looks bad. So, Hoover and he basically is like, yeah, we need to clean these guys out. This isn't good. This doesn't look good. It's not sanitary. So the chief of police of Washington, D.C., which is kind of under the White House, under the Congress, because of the way D.C. is constructed, and the Army get together and they decide that they're going to kind of move these guys, make these people leave. So here comes the Army and the police. They respond with tear gas. This shows you Camp Anacostia, which is the shanty town in Washington, D.C. Picture of the cops clearing it out. Buildings catch on fire. So World War I veterans who basically have already lost everything once now lose what little bit they have left. And they're forcibly removed from Washington, D.C. or basically chased out of Washington, D.C. A lot of people don't view that very favorably, right? Looks pretty ungrateful. So Hoover kind of unfortunately receives a whole lot of the blame because he does not fix the Great Depression. He does try a few things. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Hoover Dam, those are actually steps to try to fix it. He's trying to be very careful and cautious. He operates from an economic perspective that is just much more conservative. We have to watch how much we're spending. It's not fair to distribute taxes all over the place, right? That's Robin Hood. That's stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. That's not what we're about. And it's a valid theory. You might disagree with it. I disagree with it. But it's still a valid theory. Like, people that propose this idea there is logic behind it. And so when we criticize Hoover, it kind of ignores the fact that he did try to do some things that were pretty different. He just came at it from a very different perspective. And the problem with that was, the problem was kind of big. And it just didn't respond. Now here's the thing, FDR is going to try to do a whole lot more, but he's going to face some of the same problems in the sense that the economy doesn't want to turn around. The difference is FDR is going to convince the American people that he cares, that he's going to fix it, that he's going to keep trying things till he does fix it. Whereas with Hoover, people just didn't seem to buy it, you know? Makes for kind of an interesting issue. This won't take long because we've already kind of talked about a lot of this. If you go back to the PowerPoint, you can listen to some of these clips that have interviews with people. By 1933, 9,000 banks have failed, 30,000 companies are out of business, 12 million people are unemployed, wages have dropped even for those who still have jobs. Understand that these figures by 1933 incorporate the impact of this period from the election of 32 to FDR taking office. 1932-33 is the last time that you have an election in November and an inauguration in March. Following 1933, the inauguration gets moved to January for this very reason, that this lame duck period is not good, right? That it's dangerous for people, and it's dangerous for the economy. So, but unfortunately, you have this lame duck period, and so that just makes the whole thing worse by the time you get to 33. I mentioned hobos already, that kind of subculture. That can be kind of interesting if you're into that kind of thing. Soup kitchens, shantytowns, Hoovervilles. Again, this whole idea about the lost opportunities, educational, malnutrition, all that kind of stuff, the disruptions to families. And of course, the big question is, how much do we help people? If we help people too much, do we end up hurting people's character? Do we make them lazy? Do we make them not ever want to work again? You know, what happens if we give people a handout? And so there's lots of big questions about what to do with that. And all of this is tied up with American individualism and these ideas that we talked about in the Gilded Age, between social Darwinism and survival of the fittest, and maybe things happen beyond people's control, and where does the government in all of that? And understand that these questions still persist today. When we look at people who are struggling with poverty or take food stamps or housing assistance or whatever, they struggle because, whose fault is it? Some people would argue that it's more the fault of the economy, therefore the government should intervene. Other people would say no. People need to figure out a way to make it work. And I don't know that there's an easy answer. Just understand that we still ask this question today. It has not gone away since the Great Depression. So hopefully by the time we get through talking about the New Deal, you'll see how the United States decided, much like we did with the Progressive Era. Right? The Progressive Era saw us turning to government regulation as a way of navigating a path around socialism and communism. That we didn't want socialism and communism as was being advocated by union activities and that kind of thing. So we kind of picked this progressive regulation perspective. Well, you're going to see FDR will do very much the same thing, navigating a path between fascism and communism. And finding a way to kind of create an American system that responds and yet kind of, keeps a check on itself, or tries to anyways. So we still struggle with that navigation. We're always, as an American society, trying to navigate between extremes, and it's not always easy to do. And in the midst of that navigation, there's all these arguments about what is the right thing to do. What is the most fair for the most people. So, again, all of this kind of fits in within that. Great, the Dust Bowl. We've already kind of talked about this. World War I, expansion, the technology, the overproduction that was encouraged by the government. People took out loans. And so farmers are going to struggle. The high tariffs of the 20s cause farm prices to drop. Farmers start to overfarm even more. That depletes the soil even more. Then we have drought, and so forth and so on. So you have kind of this perfect storm of problems, some of which comes from Washington, D.C., some of which comes from nature, and some of which is encouraged because of poor management by human beings. And so a lot of these farmers will lose everything, and they'll have to pack up and they'll have to move. This is where we get that internal migration. And these guys, these families that move from the Great Plains, from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, to other places, they're often nicknamed the Okies, like Oklahoma, although they weren't all from Oklahoma. Many of them go to Southern California seeking agricultural work. Some of them go to cities, some of them go to other areas of the country that haven't been impacted by the Dust Bowl. They don't all go to Southern California, but a lot of them do. And it creates pressure on Southern California, right? All of a sudden, this migration of people that don't have enough food, don't have enough money, don't have a place to stay, show up, and they're like, hey, we're looking for work. So what does California do? This is where Upton Sinclair, right, the guy who wrote The Jungle, he was the governor of California. And he comes up with the End Poverty in California campaign, very kind of socialistic, right? So, California is going to create stress on cities, on towns, all that kind of stuff because of these people moving through. It's also going to displace Mexican immigrants, right? As they move into agricultural and become agricultural day laborers, those Mexican immigrants that had come in because of the Great Migration that pulled people to the north, those immigrants are going to be forced to leave because, well, we don't need the job competition. We don't have enough jobs for our people, right? So that kind of immigration equation is also very familiar. So again, Okies, you want to be sure you're familiar with that. And that the overall idea is that it adds to the number of the unemployed and the homeless and all that kind of stuff. So not only do we have factory workers, not only do we see middle-class people being affected, but we also have farmers being affected. So we've got another segment of the economy that is not able to participate because of all of these disruptions. Just kind of shows you. And again, the kids are very profoundly affected. So what causes the Dust Bowl? Big thing you need to know for the state of Texas, overproduction, encouraged by technology, encouraged by the government during World War I. Add to that drought, and then because of overproduction, the poor management of land. And this is going to create the circumstances that create the the migration of the Okies to Southern California. Major problems: unemployment, homelessness, hunger, and just general, like the lack of education opportunity, malnourishment, loss of savings, just general kind of problems that people have because of the economic crisis. American culture will respond to this, okay? So the general atmosphere, especially by 33, 34, is, pretty downtrodden, right? American society in general is kind of, even rich people know that they better not show off too much, right? So, everyone's kind of low-key at this point. So what do we do? Well, this is where we enter the golden age of Hollywood, which may seem kind of an ironic or an odd juxtaposition. But for people that are able to make a little bit of money, they will save money to go to the movies, to escape for a couple of hours. The same way we try to escape when we want to watch television, or we want to watch YouTube, or Netflix, or whatever, okay? Just for them, they have to go to the movie theater, right? And so this becomes what people want to do. So if you have any way to make money, you will save up money to go to the movies. And this is why it's called the golden age of Hollywood, because Hollywood's turning out movies. They're turning them out pretty inexpensively. You've got lots of people moving to Southern California, so they've got pretty good labor supply. You're going to have lots of people who bought radios in the 1920s, and they're making plenty of money. So they're, are not plenty of money. So they bought a lot of radios when they were making plenty of money. And so now, they may be broke, but they still have a radio, and it's free to listen to the radio. And so they're listening to soap operas that are sponsored by soap companies. They're listening to comedy shows. You've got things like The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck, Dorothea Lange and Life magazine. And so you kind of got this interesting where some people want to escape the problems of the Great Depression through cinema, through radio. And then you've got things like Life magazine and The Grapes of Wrath that document the reality of it. Right? So you kind of got that same kind of juxtaposition that we saw in the Gilded Age as far as culture is concerned. But most notably that you have people that are able to escape through radio and cinema. This picture right here by Grant Wood kind of embodies the Great Depression. So this takes us to the 1932 election. 1932, FDR is running for president. Okay? So is Hoover. Hoover, of course, is not very popular, but he is backed by Republicans who, kind of want to continue the same trend. And FDR is going to be a very different kind of candidate. He had been governor of New York, and while he was governor of New York, I think he becomes governor in 28 or 30 or something like that. While he's governor, he basically creates this pretty extensive relief program in New York State. And so New York State is kind of seen as a laboratory for his economic approach. This idea of providing relief money, public works, jobs programs, very much kind of government action about how to handle this depression. And so he kind of provides this that people are kind of excited about this. Now FDR, by the time he's governor of New York, he is already paralyzed. FDR was he was actually a distant cousin to Teddy Roosevelt. Tried to emulate Teddy Roosevelt, became Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Marries Teddy Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor. So Eleanor Roosevelt does not have to change her name. They're pretty distantly related, but kind of. Anyways, so he marries Eleanor, and then in 1920 he runs for the vice presidency. Okay, again, he's kind of emulating Teddy Roosevelt. Except that, Alfred Langdon loses in 1920. I think it's Langdon. And when he loses in 1920, FDR goes home and comes down with polio. And poliomyelitis, of course, attacks nerves, and it makes it so that he doesn't have the use of his legs. Now, he will eventually learn to walk a little bit, kind of, by using very, very, very stiff and tight braces that he puts on his legs that would lock his legs in place and he could walk by kind of throwing his hips, you know, and he would hold on to somebody's arm and kind of thrust his weight forward. So he didn't walk very often. There are pictures of him doing so. They typically don't show how difficult it was. Just know if you do see him standing or walking, he's doing so under a lot of pain because it hurt, because those braces had to be super, super tight. And so when he gives the "we have nothing to fear but fear itself" speech when he's inaugurated, when he gives the "this is the day that will live in infamy" after Pearl Harbor, he's standing and he's giving those speeches and doing so while he's uncomfortable, right? I mean, so he's gripping the podium to keep his balance because his legs are locked into place. So he very kind of unique guy in that sense. Lots of optimism, lots of "we can do this, we can fix it." Like I said, his model for New York State had really kind of inspired people. And so that's what you're going to see, him kind of embracing, and people kind of seeing him and thinking, yes, we want him, not Hoover, not the Republicans. We want this idea of progressive experimentation. We want the government to do something. We want the government to take action. This problem is too big, and the government needs to do something about it. And so there's kind of this idea of kind of changing the American public, changing horses, wanting a different approach, and that's absolutely what he's going to represent. Very much focused on results, right? So yeah, that's FDR and Eleanor. Like I said, they were distantly related. She was a niece of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt actually gave her away at their wedding. And he was in a different branch of the family tree. That was politically, that kind of thing. They were a little bit different. But it does kind of, it is kind of interesting. Huh? Oh, I thought somebody said something. Huh? Oh. Anyway, so you have kind of an interesting scenario there. Also, FDR was kind of a ladies' man. He had some girlfriends when he was married and in the White House. Yeah. Yeah. He was known to be very, very charming. But he was also very kind of like, he knew how to play ends against each other. His White House was known for having people that represented different opinions and kind of playing them off of each other. He was known for endorsing like 3 different plans that would all compete against each other because he wanted to see which one worked. So lots of different things like that. So FDR's reactions to the Great Depression, especially in contrast with Hoover, as well as the most significant pieces of the New Deal, including the Social Security Act. One of the things I want to point out is that you have kind of 2 New Deals that are going to happen. One is going to be right after his election. Kicks off like 1933. You'll have the 1934 midterm election, and the Democrats will win really big in 1934. So that as you come into 1935, you'll have about midway, you'll have the second New Deal. That will stay in place really all the way through 35 into 36. You'll have a presidential election in 1936. FDR will win, but he's facing some criticism. The Great Depression is still lingering. People are asking hard questions about is this the right approach? And so the Democrats lose a few seats in Congress. And you see the second New Deal is not quite as big as the first New Deal. And by the time you get to the next midterm election, by 1938, we got some other stuff going on, don't we? What else do we have going on by 38? What do you guess? What do you think's going on by 38? Yes, Hitler and Japan invading China. World affairs, foreign policy is beginning to dominate by 37, by 38, so that you see that really once you get to 1938, there's not a whole lot of discussion about a New Deal. It's not that the New Deal still isn't in place, because it is, but we're not adding new programs. So most of what we're going to talk about is going to be in the first 6 years of FDR's terms as president. So when he wins in 1932, he'd been pretty vocal throughout the campaign that he thought one of the problems with the American economy was it was still tied to the gold standard. So remember way back when we talked about populists and farmers and we talked about this whole gold versus silver and rigid money supply versus loose money supply? Well, we're still on that gold standard, right? And it means that it's a lot harder for the government to just spend. And so FDR says we need to go off the gold standard. By this point in 1932, just about every country in the world is off the gold standard. Britain's off the gold standard, Germany's off the gold standard, France is off the gold standard. I mean, we're like that last really super developed country that still uses gold as a standard for our money. And so he's saying we're going to go off of that. So one of the problems is people know that's what he's thinking about doing. And he wins the 32 election, but he can't take office until 1933. So between November of 32 and March of 33, people are terrified. Oh my gosh, we're going to switch. We're going to go off the gold standard. What's that going to do to the economy? What's it going to do to the banks? Are the banks going to close? And it causes another wave of bank failures and bank panics. So much so that you have states having to institute bank holidays just for no reason. Just shut the banks down all on one day because we got to get people to calm down, right? This will be an idea that you'll see FDR bring with him when he wins the 1932 election. So when we get to 1933, he'll institute a national bank holiday to kind of calm things down. But again, this is part of why the economy, as we're going into the beginning of 1933, is so bad. Because Hoover's still president in January and February of 1933, but not able to do anything because the American people have already decided they want somebody completely different. And so that's going to create a great deal of chaos politically or economically. So again, you've got two phases to the New Deal. You want to kind of keep that in mind. FDR's attitude is going to be just do something. Let's throw it against the wall, see what happens, see if it works. If it doesn't work, we throw it away, we do something else. Very experimental. Now that can be good, and that's certainly what the American public wanted. But it also has its own consequences. Sometimes these programs will be started pretty quickly without really kind of fully analyzing what the implications are. This is why there's lots of unintended consequences to the New Deal. And of course, he's constantly trying to find, different points of view, different perspectives. Relies on the brains trust to kind of give him advice. So that's a big part of what he's doing. We can kind of argue that it's under the New Deal that we have all these different programs. We call them alphabet soup because they go by the AAA, the CCC, the WPA, the PWA, the NRA, and HOLC. And there's all these kinds of letters that kind of make up these different programs. And of course, what Roosevelt's arguing is that this is the evolution of new government. That it's not about revolution, it's not about communism, it's not about socialism. It's about creating a new kind of American government. So again, this idea of kind of navigating extremes. That's what he's trying to argue and kind of make a point about. So it's evolution, not revolution, gentlemen. So again, they call the first 100 days, the first 90 days, 100 days, because he gets 15 pieces of legislation passed. That's unheard of, guys. This is where that whole 100 days analogy comes from. I don't know if you remember last year. What's Trump going to do in his first 100 days? This is where that comes from. Because FDR in his first 100 days passed 15 pieces of legislation. And ever since then, that first 100 days is supposed to be some kind of magical thing. It's not really. It was unique, right? But it shows you what a crisis the country was in. Also, it shows you how solidly the Democrats had control of the country. So, FDR will begin his process of fireside chats. These fireside chats take the message to the people. This is what the program we're trying. This program is supposed to fix this. This is what we hope to happen. Hang with us. We're going to try to fix this. He doesn't do fireside chats all the time, but he does them in key points. And one of them, of course, is going to be his first fireside chat where he talks about the banking crisis. And all of this is meant to instill kind of optimism and hope and kind of encourage people to kind of have faith in him and faith in his government. And just, the things are going to get better. They're going to fix it. Okay, so we're going to stop here with the first 100 days. I'm going to play the link there to the inaugural address, so that way you kind of hear what he has to say about that.